now we have to assume that several of the apology and several of the dialogues dealing with the person of Socrates and what happened to him around the time of his trial and sentencing and his death. So that extends over about 5 of the dialogues. We've read the apology, you recall, and that's where the meat of the occurrence is reflected. And I did mention, I think last time, that in ancient times, for instance, ancient Athens, people were trained to remember things they heard verbatim because writing materials were scarce and expensive, right? We understand all of that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so they just it was part of the deal of being an adult member of a city's population. You're a free person, you're mature, you have property, you have responsibilities, and so you're going to remember what you hear other people say, particularly interesting people like Socrates. If you are an adult student of Socrates, you can't really take notes as you wander around the agora with Socrates. You have to remember what he said. Therefore, we can at least safely assume that the picture we get of Socrates in the dialogues, especially the apology, around the time of Socrates' death, that picture is reasonably accurate, that he probably said something pretty close to what Plato said he said. Now, in the analogy of the cave, the story of the cave in the Republic, which is in a much later book of Plato's, here you still have this character Socrates, and he's actually talking to Plato's older brother, Glaucon. Presumably, personally, I don't think we can believe that this dialogue, and the Republic is also ultimately a dialogue, is as accurate as, say, the Apology or the Phaedo or the Crito, okay? Because we're asked to believe that Glaucon and Socrates, the only 2 people that are featured in the story, are, there may have been a conversation, but I think a lot of this comes from Plato himself and was not originally in the language or in the words of Socrates himself. You understand what I'm saying here? I don't think we can presume the same degree of fidelity to what was said in some discussion 40 years earlier, let's say. Okay. I think Plato's had a few thoughts of his own in the meantime and has developed his own viewpoint on political matters. This is politics. I'm not even sure that Socrates ever speculated about a legislator, or what he also appears in other writings of Plato as the philosopher king. Okay.
Oh yeah. The philosopher king was like, basically he said the ruling class, the working class, and the fighting class, they're all the same, and the ruler should be a philosopher king.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, he developed that further in his last dialogue, which is also even bigger than the Republic. It was called The Laws. Okay, and again, my point is, here I think we can safely talk about Plato's thought. He's dressing it up still in the guise of a dialogue with Socrates being the main interlocutor, because he was very comfortable with this. It had worked for him, so to speak. And this is another way for him to pay continued homage now to the memory of his teacher, his mentor, his master. Okay. So I don't think we can assume that by this point in time, the time when the Republic, which this is book 7 of the Republic, the allegory of the cave, I don't think that we need to think, oh, Socrates taught this. You understand what I'm saying? Everybody clear on that point?
Yes.
Okay, I'm trying to make
Yes.
it between what Plato taught and what Socrates taught. And since Socrates wrote nothing, I think we're safe in assuming that the character of Socrates is faithfully reproduced so far as the episode of the trial and what preceded it, and then his month in his cell afterwards and how he died. Okay, that's Socrates, but he's a convenient medium through which Socrates communicates. What Plato wishes to communicate about his own discoveries, his own system of thought, years after he wrote those earlier dialogues. Right? Okay, yeah. That's the point I wanted to make. Okay, Amy, do you have any further thoughts on the allegory of the cave? Anything else you want to contribute here?
Okay. So, if those prisoners thought that the cave was the best the world could be, maybe like there's a better world out there for us, and we don't know how to get to it.
Well, think about it. The person represented by the image of the one person who was freed, he couldn't free himself. None of these people can liberate themselves. Is that right?
But they don't have like the same thoughts that we do or something like that.
Well, again, we're asked to visualize a situation which is quite strange. These people are sitting there, their heads are in some kind of restraint. We don't talk about how how do you sleep like that? I mean, seriously.
Yeah.
It's
they don't sleep.
Maybe they actually just don't sleep.
Well, that's weird. Sleep is necessary, right? To recharge the battery, so to speak. Socrates is speculating. Just imagine this. He's saying to Glaucon, picture this. Imagine this. And we have a very bizarre image that emerges from reading the first few pages of this book 7 of the Republic. You've got this cave, you've got these people just sitting and looking at a wall because that's all they can do. This doesn't correspond to any kind of real situation. Nonetheless, we still do have a certain sort of person today in our society who can be judged and put on trial for committing some kind of crime, and this sentence is going to involve, let's see, prison or state penitentiary or some kind of imposed constraint on a person, much more humane than the images of the allegory here. But still, that person is, to an extent, cut off from the rest of society. And incidentally, to provide a kind of transition to our final reading, the One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. Ivan Denisovich is a prisoner in Stalin's gulag. Okay.
In
And
Siberia, in prison, I think.
and his conditions are very severe, and the condition of the other prisoners. And so we do know what a prisoner is. We're going to have different images depending on our own experience, our own study of the subject. Does any of you know anybody who has spent time in prison?
No.
You don't? Okay.
No.
Well, I have met such people. Maybe they were political prisoners in the Soviet Union or in one of the Eastern European countries. I've actually come to know a fair number of those people as a result of my own academic and personal interests. So I could tell you what it was like, and at least one of those people was an American, a fellow named Victor Herman from Detroit. He ended up spending, let's see, how many years? Something like 30 or 40 years in the gulags and psychiatric hospitals and prisons of Stalin's Russia, and even years after that. He had his own interesting story. He was an American of Russian descent. His family returned to Russia under Stalin in 1929 or early 1930s. Their condition in the United States was not particularly good. They saw the promise of a brighter future back in Russia, but now, of course, it's under Stalin, and turned out, of course, not to be anything the way that they'd been told it would be. A lot of Americans went back to Russia looking for a brighter future during our depression, and a number of them never came back to the United States. They ended up spending the rest of their lives in some punitive situation over there. So I've known people like that. So my experience obviously is different from yours. And I've known people who've spent time in the penal system of the United States. Okay, we still have prisoners. We still have people whose circumstances of their lives are quite limited as a result of a decision that has been made that did not go well for them, that was a consequence of some action. Now, nowhere in this allegory do we have any idea as to why these people are set up, right? Why they're sitting there. You know, it's just what you're given as a premise for the story, right? You don't say they were convicted of these crimes. It says that they're pretty much, what does it say? That they're born into this situation, or what was it? Do we recall that? Early on, something is said. Do we recall? I mean, let me go here. Phoebe, living in an underground den, which has a mouth open toward the life. Here they have been from their childhood. So there's no reference to they are guilty of this and therefore they must of some crime. It's a given, and we can't make much of that. We just have to accept, if we're going to discuss this allegory, we have to take these wildly implausible images on board as what we're told, right? That's it. Is that correct? Everybody on board with this?
Yes.
Okay, these people are not ever said to be criminals. That's just the conditions of their life. They serve as a vessel or a vehicle for Plato to make his points in the guise of Socrates, of course, but this is Plato speaking here, really. Okay. So any other observations? Alan, anything else you want to say about this?
Uh, like they're comparing the prisoners, like humans, regular humans who are ignorant and stubborn, who do not like to be proved wrong, because when the philosopher or the freed prisoner came back with his discoveries, they thought he was just like something was wrong with him and did not. They basically destroyed any attempt for the freed prisoner to free them.
Okay. Do you think perhaps in modern Western literature, or even in political reality in the West, that new ideas are often greeted with suspicion and even ridicule? What do you think?
Yeah, sometimes new ideas are not always like accepted. Laws, they start out as bills, and many of them just go to the trash can. Uh, like
It happens that I've been reading in another area recently, and I'm finding some interesting things. Have you ever wondered why it was that since 1972, Americans have not returned to the moon?
yeah, I was also thinking about that. I'm like, why not? But
Yeah, it's
like,
almost as if, okay, been there, done that, and
yeah,
nothing.
we're great. We're great. We don't need to do any more of that.
And believe it or not, that is an extensive, a common mindset that you find at NASA today. All the talk at NASA, the public relations part of all of that, to this day is about, well, we're going to go to Mars now. And the fact is, we're not going to go to Mars. Human beings, American astronauts, are not going to go to Mars from Earth. We're going to have to stage on the moon for financial reasons. Did you know that it was calculated during the time of the Apollo program, when 12 Americans in 6 different flights did actually land on the moon and walk around on the moon? The first one was
Neil
Apollo.
Armstrong.
11 was the first one, okay?
Yeah.
Went through
13
7,
was a failure.
but 11, 12, 14, 15, 16, and 17. There was always one in the return vehicle that was orbiting the moon, and then the lander would, the 2 men that were on the moon get back in the lander and rendezvous with the orbiting ship and then go back to Earth. Now, all of that was very, very expensive, very cumbersome, and it was calculated that the vehicle itself, the main Saturn rocket, and the 3 stages, that all of these had to weigh at least 100 metric tons.
Wow.
And most of that would be what? Fuel.
Yeah, fuel. It's basically all fuel. Like, the Odyssey was the only thing that was.
Yeah, wow, looky there. How about that? Very nice. Looky there. Wonderful. Okay, but this is very expensive. This is extremely expensive.
The only
Is
thing,
this the Lego version?
yeah, the only
Cool.
thing that came back was this one piece right here. This is the Odyssey.
Yes.
This is the one piece out of this entire fuel thing that came back to Earth.
Uh-huh. All right, now, what about if we set up, we staged a number of less expensive flights to the moon and set up a base there? You're going to have a favorable situation with regard to gravity, so you're not going to have nearly as much fuel expended to escape Earth's gravity, to escape the gravity of the moon, which is 1/6 that of Earth.
Yes, you can jump 6 times higher on the moon than Earth.
Right. So think about this. It would just seem to me, and I've always thought it made sense, and this was actually a proposal advanced by Bush 41. George H.W. Bush proposed that we establish a permanent base on the moon, which would serve as a kind of launch pad for the ultimate Mars mission that we could actually afford. Right?
Yes.
It's also been discovered, by the way, do you know this? It's been discovered that there is water ice at the poles on the moon.
Cool.
Perhaps as much as
Yeah.
a billion tons of water ice in craters near the poles, both north and south poles of the moon, which are never exposed to sunlight, to direct sun. And so
But
this ice doesn't melt.
because
Or it could provide one of the absolute necessities of any permanent human settlement on the moon, which is water. Right? But unfortunately, this vision of George H.W. Bush has never been really followed up on, and the culture at NASA is still not interested in this settlement on the moon, building a lunar base from which further voyages of exploration and discovery could be made to asteroids and to Mars.
Yeah, some people were even proposing ISS 2.0, which was to rotate around the moon. I mean, revolve around the moon or orbit the moon.
Well, but all these things seem to go nowhere.
Yeah,
All
and
of them
then
seem to
the
go
ISS
nowhere.
3.0 to go around Mars.
Well, but all of these, this up to now, all we have is talk.
Yes.
We have conferences after conferences after conferences, decade after decade. This is the prevailing culture. This is the prevailing culture. So frankly, I don't expect to see any human beings on Mars. And frankly, I don't think we're going to go back to the moon again anytime soon, unless there is some major cultural change in the attitude of the people at NASA, who are interested more in preserving their own jobs as opposed to actually, look at this. This is great. You love this stuff, don't you? This is great.
the lunar module.
Okay, was that that Eagle? Eagle was the first
Yeah,
one.
the eagle.
Uh-huh. Okay. That's neat. That's neat. Thank you for sharing that with us. Yep. Okay. Wonderful. Have you ever been down to Huntsville and seen the what goes on down there in Alabama? Part of the program?
Oh yeah, the space, what was it? The space camp, I think.
Yes. I've been getting a lot of my information from a book called The Value of the Moon. I will try to remember to bring that and share it with you all next time. The fact of the matter is that human beings have always looked to the skies and wondered, what's up there. Perfectly natural, perfectly natural. And with John F. Kennedy's vision of landing a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s, we actually, got our act together, so to speak, and made this happen. And the reason we made this commitment was just before John F. Kennedy was elected in October of 1959. The Sputnik was 59, it's 58, let me think. No, October of 58, excuse me, or was it even 57? I remember I took Russian in high school, and I was in the first class of students to do that anywhere in the country, because that was a direct follow-up to the Soviet success in launching Sputnik
Yes.
1 and 2.
And then it was some like, it was Alan Shepard that flew the Mercury something.
Yes. There were several Mercury launches, and then came Gemini, and then came Apollo.
Apollo, yeah, Gemini and Apollo.
Right. We got things done back then. We got things done because this galvanized American public opinion. Yeah, let's go there. Let's show those Russians. Soviets never landed on the moon. We did, but the downside of that is, now what?
Yeah, now China and Russia, now they're going to go to the moon.
Yeah, there
Well,
might be that all
technology
we do is plan, just like NASA. You said
Yeah,
we plan, we plan, we plan.
just the first one.
All you have to do is probably just get the old blueprints of Apollo 11, modify them a little bit.
You just get to brag that you're the first one to get on the moon.
Yeah.
Well,
It's really useless.
Older technology.
Oh, we got on the moon first, but what are you gonna do with being on the moon first? You put an American flag.
well, that was good, and that was interesting, and we did what the president said we should do, but we really need to follow up on what's been suggested in the way of a permanent base and exploiting resources like helium-3 and other mineral resources, besides being able to take advantage of the presence of water ice, which dictates where it is that we need to set up camp, with either in the North Pole area or in the South Pole area of the moon. And as I said, this one book was from a fellow who was on the inside. He worked on several of these task forces, if you will. And I'll bring that next time. I don't think you're familiar with this, Nathan, but I'll bring it so you can see it. And I'm sure you'd like to add that to your reference library on the subject so far. And see, well, now, why is it, and this, now we're getting into philosophy, okay? Why is it that we do dumb things? And why do people, why do they talk about doing things or don't actually do them? Because if they just keep talking, then they keep getting paid. How about that?
That's a nice book. Like, I'd actually want to read it.
Yeah, I will bring that, Nathan, so you can all see this. Amy, does this sound mildly intriguing?
Yeah.
Yeah, this has been going on. You say, well, wait a minute, we haven't done a thing in terms of walking around and collecting samples and so on. Do you know, in the National Cathedral in Washington, there is a moon rock in a stained glass window? That was a neat thing, right? But when you get right down to it, there's been no follow-on, as opposed, for example, to the opening up of the great American West. Think for a moment of the Lewis and Clark expedition of 1803. Jefferson sent a couple of his Virginia buddies. Both of these Lewis and Clark had fought in the Revolutionary War, and now it's almost 30 years later, and he gets them to organize a mission to go out and discover what it is that the country had done in purchasing for the equivalent of $15 million, which is nothing, enough land to double the size of the United States. And he sends these two fellows out, and they have some other people in the expedition, and they write their journals, and they come back 2 or 3 years later to report to President Jefferson, what is this new land, Louisiana Purchase, that eventually becomes part of, I don't know, 14 states or something. And we keep on building and settling the West, and it's a continuing process, right? People are taking action, making decisions to open up this territory. You got the Pony Express, you got all these new states, all these new farmlands, and here comes the railroad in the 1820s, and by the 1860s or so, 1869 is the first transcontinental railroad.
Yes.
So in about the same time span as from 1972 to now, you've got the entire West being settled and organized. You've got a continuous development. You don't have anything like that in our space program.
The East is like developing very slowly because it's already very populated. 70% of the population's like East, and only 30 is West. But the West, like in California, the population is growing faster than like some parts of the East, because the East is already like urbanized.
Well, let's see. 1867, didn't you have the purchase of Alaska also, which gave
Yeah,
a
well,
whole...
Alaska is not growing. It's not growing. It's like just...
Well, the last time I was there, I saw a fair amount of growth. No, it's not comparable simply because of the climate.
Yeah.
Okay. But the Russians probably would still have Alaska if we had not already shown an active interest in developing the Western lands all the way to the Pacific. That's why it made sense for us to buy Alaska from the Russians. If the United States in the 1860s, forget the Civil War for a moment, was still basically east of the Mississippi River, what possible interest would we have had with Alaska? See what I mean?
Yes.
So all of this...
Alaska, it was bought like for like $7 million. Now it's like $47 billion.
Something like that. Something like that.
And it makes it
very strategically important for us. There was a lot of gold up there, a lot of silver, forests, resources, oil, North Slope oil, and so I appreciate these things. All right, thank you, fellas, for getting those essays to me. All right, now let's. We got a little bit of time left here. I want to go on and discuss Mere Christianity. Have all of you read Mere Christianity?
I accidentally like read some last week, and then my mom said, "Wait, you're doing Plato's The Cave. You're doing The Cave this week," and I stopped reading it.
Okay, but do you remember the circumstances of this book? How did it come to be?
No.
Okay. Mere Christianity originated as
I had like the first 2 pages.
Wow. Okay. A series of radio addresses by C.S. Lewis, who was a scholar at Oxford at the time. He eventually went to Cambridge, but he was at Oxford. And he was a professor. But he had already written, I think by this time, no, he wrote this later, something called the Chronicles of Narnia. Familiar with that?
I've heard of it, but
The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
This was
yeah.
in the Second World War to like boost morale.
Mm-hmm. Continue your thought, Alan.
Like I think like people that were in London were bombed by like the Luftwaffe.
Yeah.
And wanted like more morale so they could fight against the Nazis.
Yes.
And eventually defeat them in 1945.
Right. And it was clearly understood by the powers that be at the British Broadcasting Corporation that the British people needed a rationale and needed some spiritual sustenance, so to speak. They were bombed by hundreds of planes day and night for several months. Not just London. London was the main target, but throughout the British Isles, or throughout Great Britain anyway. The Luftwaffe was bombing civilians. And of course, many thousands perished. And a lot of people were very, shall we say, psychologically assaulted, not just physically. It was very demoralizing to be exposed to these terrible attacks day and night. Now, the Royal Air Force did the best it could to challenge the Luftwaffe. They sent their pilots up day after day to engage the fighters and occasionally to take on the bombers themselves, and make Hitler pay, not just in planes and men, but pay for the losses, to incur unacceptable levels of damage to his Air Force. And eventually that succeeded, but the British people would not have been able to endure if they did not have, first of all, from the King and from Winston Churchill as Prime Minister, who also took to the airwaves of the BBC to try to perk up the spirits and the morale of the British people. And basically, C.S. Lewis was asked to contribute his thoughts, which he did in a series of addresses about the importance of Christianity to what British people were, and why they had a moral obligation to preserve themselves and to be victorious in this terrible conflict, the struggle against what was clearly the forces of evil, right? And he was asked to sort of clarify that, because for the most part, Christianity in Britain had become a nominal thing. Yes, Britain was a Christian country, but there weren't a lot of people who deeply understood and appreciated the message of Christianity over the centuries. Basically, that God cares about you and you are his creation, and so on and so forth. And therefore, it was important to be on the right side of this war. He did that, and then the book was published. Actually, let me see. Let me check my memory here. The book, the lectures, The Case for Christianity, Christian Behavior, Beyond Personality. These are actually published during the warfare, the war separately, and then in 1952 published together in this book, Mere Christianity, which we have today. Now let's give you a little background on C.S. Lewis himself and why he was actually the natural choice for this. Not only was he the author of these beloved children's books, the Chronicles of Narnia, and he actually wrote several science fiction novels, such as Out of the Silent Planet. But that's not really the most important thing about him. Very important was that he was a scholar of Christianity. He taught at Oxford. He had students. He was particularly like his friend J.R.R. Tolkien. You've heard that name, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, The Hobbit, and so on, all of that, Lord of the Rings. And he and Lewis and a few other people were known as a literary group, the Inklings. And they were very much interested in medieval and later English literature. They contributed to it themselves. So they were scholars at both Oxford and Cambridge. Here's a war that comes along and upsets everybody's apple cart, and you've got to think about the basics of survival in a really terrible, grim time. And all of this, the Battle of the Blitz, started in 1940 before the United States was committed to defend the British and the French and so on. So basically, Britain was alone on the world stage at this time, right?
But I think they could have done better if they just declared war on Germany when they took Czechoslovakia.
They weren't ready for that. They weren't ready to do that. That was not anything like public sentiment would not have supported it. You couldn't have gotten it through Parliament. Okay, because remember, England had lost a generation of young men in the First World War in the trenches of Europe, and here it is already, the ominous development of a formidable military, and British people thought that the Germans couldn't possibly do that, but it turns out they could. Of course, they refused to keep on paying reparations. And, Woodrow Wilson said that to justify American entrance into the war, this is going to be the war to end war. Winston Churchill had promised that, and yet the United States, at the end of the war, basically did not want to accept the crown of leadership of the rest of the world, so just go back into just being involved in the affairs of this hemisphere. That was the attitude. That was the mentality in the United States. It was also clearly the attitude in Britain. Now, Britain did have, and France both, a defense treaty with Poland. And frankly, when Hitler invaded Poland on the 1st of September, 1939, Britain and France had to declare war then. They weren't really ready for it even so. They have not appropriated the money necessary to build a force capable of challenging Hitler on the continent, or even of adequately defending England. So England was not prepared. The French certainly were not prepared. And if anybody should have known the danger that Germany represented, it was the French right next door. But their sentiment was basically, listen, we lost.
In 1911 to 1921, the net migration was negative 92,000.
From where to where?
Yeah. 1901 to 1911 was 385,000 overall change. And then in 1911 to 1921, it was only 195,000.
From where to where, Alan?
The UK population. They already lost a lot of.
Yeah. And so they weren't ready to sacrifice the next generation.
Yeah, World War II, it was, actually there were more births in World War II, but there were many more deaths.
Yeah. But the point is, again, that this is in understanding the real message of a literary work, it is my firm conviction as a professional historian that you do need to understand the circumstances within which something is written or presented to the world. And here you have these wartime addresses to the nation to rally the British not only around the flag, that was pretty much the job of the king and parliament, but also to stiffen the moral fiber of the nation. And that's what C.S. Lewis, who had himself fought in the trenches in France during World War I, was called the Great War at the time because nobody in, say, 1914 could imagine that there would be another war 20 years later. But indeed, that's what was going to happen between 1919 and 1939, much to the dismay of a lot of people. Certainly, nobody was saying, "Oh, goody, let's go fight again." You know, no.
Maybe only Germany wants to do that.
Well, and that was the message of the German National Socialist Workers' Party, which of course is the Nazi party. And Hitler was member number 7 of that party. Yeah, that was his membership card, and had worked ceaselessly to bring this about. He had been a corporal in that war, and that's Churchill actually referred to Corporal Hitler in quite a few of his speeches to cut him down to size in the perception of the British people. Well, we can beat these guys, it's a corporal, right? Which is a rank of the enlisted people in the soldiers, right? Corporal. It's just above private. Okay. So he wasn't a general. He wasn't a commander of armies during the war. And of course, once he's the Führer, which is the leader, then he can call himself whatever he wants, and he customarily appears in uniform and wants everybody to do that salute. Heil Hitler, right?
Yep.
Okay. So World War II didn't have to happen, but it was, the table was set by the terms of the First War, and Germany had lost its bearings. The German people had produced remarkable monuments of culture and civilization, music and philosophy and literature and science and so on. And they were in a dark place after the war, but many Germans secretly did not believe they'd lost that war because, after all, they were not occupied by the victorious alliance of the Western powers. They were not occupied. obviously after 1945 or in 1945, let's see, as of the 8th of May, we've just had our 75th anniversary of VE Day, the defeat of Germany, which is immediately followed by the occupation of Germany, the division of Germany into 4 occupied zones: the British, the French, the American, and the Russian, which eventually led to the independent West Germany and the Soviet satellite East Germany. But the point is, the Germans, of course, they'd been bombed into oblivion. Starting already in 1942, British and Americans returned what the damage that the Luftwaffe had done to Britain. They started regularly bombing Germany. I think the British during the day and the Americans at night, something like that. And Germany was pretty much in ruins. And then here came the forces of the occupation. And so to speak, we did it right the second time around. That was one of the lessons we had to learn. But in the meantime, it was also important during that crucial year of 1940, when Britain is basically standing alone against the terrifying might of the Axis. America is involved in the Lend-Lease program to send them ships and so on, which eventually is extended to the Soviet Union after, in June of 1941, Hitler turns on his ally, Stalin, and tries to, go really farther than he possibly could to conquer Russia, which is a mistake. Who else had made in history? Who else had tried to conquer?
Napoleon.
Yes, in the previous century. And the greatest ally of the Russians was not a nation state. The greatest ally of the Russians was General Zima. General Zima, Winter. Right? That's a figure of speech, General Winter. And that defeated both Napoleon and Hitler. Worst winter in more than a century.
Because it got really so cold that they couldn't keep up with the heat, and they lost like illness and not even war.
Yeah, there
Lost more
more.
men from hypothermia, freezing, frostbite than actually.
Yes. And if Hitler had been prudent and realistic and equipped his troops with winter gear, the outcome might have been quite different. I remember when I visited Leningrad in 1979, one thing I did was see the war memorial in Leningrad, which is a series of mass graves, a very long, I think at least maybe 150 yards, a series of mounds. And at the front of the mound, you have either a hammer and sickle on a stone tablet, so to speak, or a star. The hammer and sickle were the civilians that were piled into the grave.
Oh, and the star was like the Russian
The military, absolutely. Okay.
And the hammer and sickle were like the workers, they work like
Right.
on the flag, and then the star represented like the Russian like military.
Yes. And so there was something like 900,000 people that died in the siege of Leningrad, which went on for about a year. And this one place is, I mean, when you're standing, it's like visiting Arlington Cemetery or something, only it's more graphic, because you can easily imagine underneath these mounds of earth that go on for, and I think there were like 6 of these parallel. And there's hundreds of thousands of bodies anonymously buried there. Either they starved to death or they were casualties of the relentless attack, bombing, and so on. So war is a terrible thing, and nobody knows that better than military people who have to, be on the front lines and suffer all the privation and horror of war. So anyway, that's the sort of thing that C.S. Lewis is in the middle of when he's choosing to address the British people on the subject of what are we fighting for? Germany was no longer a Christian nation. Germany by this time had become the very embodiment of brutal paganism. Christian leaders in Germany are being relentlessly persecuted by the regime. So it's pretty easy to imagine that if they had actually conquered England and occupied it, which they had intended to do, that then you would have had a destruction on a massive scale of the Christian environment in Britain. The idea of a master race, of course, is pure paganism. And this is what Hitler was angling for. In the early days of his rule as Chancellor of Germany in the early 1930s, 1933 to be precise.
Yeah, he was like the chancellor, but when the president or something, like the bigger ruler, like the chancellor is like the vice president and like whatever the person, there's a person above him, but that person,
the president,
and then the president died, so he became the president and the chancellor. So he was a Führer.
Führer. Führer is a German pronunciation, meaning simply the leader.
Yeah, the
leader. A new title. In Italy, at the same time, we got Mussolini, and for some time he has been the Duce, which also means leader, okay, from Italian. So
then he got complete power. There's no such thing as whatever.
Yeah, so these are totalitarian dictators, but totalitarianism then meaning striving after the absolute control of not only the physical and financial assets of the country and of policy and of the armed forces and of the security services, but also with ceaseless propaganda from radio speakers on street corners and evidence of the military men in uniform to be seen all over the country. This is mind control to the extent that they could. Today, unfortunately, mind control is possible at a whole other level, as we witness in China with the idea of social credit. You've heard of that, okay? And the far more efficiently than was ever true of Stalin's Russia or Hitler's Germany, far more than that, you have a surveillance state in China, and it's frightening. It really is, and we bear some responsibility for that because we developed the technology, which then they reverse engineered to surveil everyone, all 400 million Chinese people. And that's frightening because that is totalitarianism in its most developed form. When you're able to control the thought process of every single citizen. Hitler would have wished he had the technology that China has today to do those things. Now, during World War II, of course, the Western, the powers, the Americans, the British, the French, really didn't know very much about what was going on inside of Germany. The concentration camps particularly, they knew something about that, but they only found the full extent of the horror at the end of the war when the Americans occupied many of these camps. And Eisenhower insisted on seeing the worst of it himself personally. So he didn't forget that at the end of the war. He was given a tour of Buchenwald and so on, and saw things no American soldier had ever seen before. But he insisted on seeing it. And basically, Eisenhower, who was of German descent himself ethnically, right? Of course, he was American, but it's an Eisenhower means iron worker in German. And that's what his family had been in the old country. And so he had an extra motivation to stick it to the Germans as hard as he possibly could. And this resolve was strengthened in him by what he saw in the concentration camps after the war. Okay. So we're going to get into Mere Christianity a little more deeply next time. And I don't know, I haven't looked at what Dr. Lee brought in yet. Were these essays that you've turned in about the allegory of the cave, or was one of them, let's say, about the Mere Christianities, because there was an essay prompt for that? Do you have that essay prompt?
No, we did not receive it from Dr. Lee.
No.
Okay, Amy, did you get the prompt for the Mere Christianity?
Yeah.
Okay, so you got it. Do you have it available to you?
Not now.
Okay, I'm going to ask all of you to identify a major theme in a major theme, and specify the ways in which Lewis develops it. Do you find his argument persuasive? Why or why not? A major theme. So identify a major theme in Mere Christianity and specify the ways in which Lewis develops it. That's the prompt. Do you find his argument persuasive? Why or why not? So that's going. We will continue our discussion of Mere Christianity, obviously, next in our next meeting, and then we have Solzhenitsyn after that, and there is an essay prompt for that as well. And all of you have that book, and that will be our. I don't think the plan is to try a third session with this program this school year. I don't think so, because this takes us all the way to the, let's see, 10th, 17th. Yeah, this takes us to the 31st, if I'm not mistaken. These two books, am I right? Today's the 10th. And then the C.S. Lewis essay is due for next week, which is the 17th. And then we meet on the 24th and finally on the 31st of the month, those are Sundays, to do Solzhenitsyn. So, then we're in June. So I don't think we're going to have a further session after this year. So believe it or not, last year we had 4 full sessions, right? I think we had 4. If it was I think we started in October or something of last year. Now for next year, we will have, you guys will be in the sophomore year class, which we're doing that immediately after this class. Amy, your sister's in that class. And we started that a little earlier than we did this. So possibly we're going to be getting into a third session with them. I'm not sure. But Dr. Lee is talking about going on into a third year of the program. But in any case, class will only be starting in January after the first semester of school. Hi, John Lai. We're finishing up this class here. Nice to see you. So we're talking about the next couple of weeks in this freshman class, and I don't think we're going to be going into a third session. Are we in the second session now, John Lai?
For us,
I
we're
think so.
Okay, I